In this video, I will provide a few highlights of Russian and Soviet history, focusing on events with long-lasting impact on both Russia and the other contemporary countries in Eurasia. Before getting into Soviet history, I wanted to mention two key legacies bestowed on the Soviet Union by the Russian Empire. This was both a multi-ethnic population and a tradition of centralized rule. The Russian Empire expanded from its heartland centered on Moscow and St. Petersburg to Siberia in the 1600s, and then expanding its European holdings under Peter and Catherine the Great in the 1700s. Most of Central Asia and the Caucasus was then added to the empire in the 1800s. The result of this expansion can be shown in the 1897 census of the Russian Empire, which was the only one ever taken. That census found that only 45% of the population were Russian speakers. Despite the dramatic break of the Russian Revolution, many political traditions we see as typically Soviet, from the use of Siberian exile and the forced relocation of populations to the idea of revolution from above, actually date to Tsarist times, and were attempts by Tsars like Peter to maintain political control while modernizing a predominantly agricultural economy. The Russian Revolution itself was complicated. The reason we refer to the October Revolution of 1917 is that there were actually two revolutions that year. The February Revolution, a series of mass protests, led to the abdication of the Tsar. Factional politics then ensued, with Lenin returning from exile and eventually leading his faction, the Bolsheviks, to power when they seized the institutions of government in St. Petersburg in November 1917. Yes, the October Revolution took place in November. There was a 2-week difference between the Orthodox calendar and the Western calendar that the Soviet Union later adopted. One of the first tasks of government was to actually get out of World War I, which it did to its disadvantage. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 gave the Central Powers, aka Germany and Austria-Hungary, control over the Baltics and territory from what is now Belarus and Ukraine. Otherwise, much of what came to define the politics of the Soviet Union was present at the beginning, including state control of the media and, after a 1918 assassination attempt on Lenin, the Red Terror, which is a series of mass arrests and executions designed to consolidate political control. Economically, though, Lenin's rule was defined by the New Economic Policy, which combined limited privatization and free trade in an attempt to help recover from World War I and the civil war that followed the revolution. The system of central planning that we associate with Soviet economics came into being in the 1930s. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union forcibly collectivized about 90% of its agricultural land and began to move its economy to a more industrial base. This in part led to the Great Famine of 1932-33, which affected much of the Soviet Union, but particularly Ukraine and Kazakhstan. An estimated 4 or 5 million people died in Ukraine, and around 2 million people in Kazakhstan, which at the time represented about 40% of Kazakhstan's population. Stalin also exerted totalitarian control over the political system. During the Great Purge, he used arbitrary arrest and execution to consolidate his personal power to an extent never seen before. For example, of the 2,000-odd delegates in the 1934 Communist Party Congress, half had been arrested by 1939, while 100 of the 150 Central Committee members had been subjected to show trials and executed. Some estimate that around 5% of the overall population of the Soviet Union was arrested between 1937 and 1938. After the purge, he then reinforced his rule through a cult of personality. I'd like to offer a quick side note on World War II. Russia complains a little bit too much about the West not recognizing the Soviet role in World War II, but they do have a point about this. World War II was horrible for the Soviet Union. It wasn't, the Holocaust, but around 25 million Soviet citizens died in the war. That represented about 2/3 of all military deaths and around 40% of all civilian deaths. The Eastern Front was incredibly important, and remembering World War II on Victory Day, which is May 9th, has become a very important patriotic holiday across Eurasia. It's marked both by military parades and by what I find to be very charming civilian marches, where families carry photos of their relatives who fought in World War II to remember them. Anyway, the end of World War II gave us the Cold War and the final borders of the Soviet Union, which reclaimed the Baltic states and portions of Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. So Nikolai Khrushchev came to power after Stalin's death and liberalized the political and economic spheres somewhat. Aside from the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev is probably most famous for delivering the secret speech, which criticized Stalin's reign of terror and began a period of rehabilitation of political prisoners and censorship. So Khrushchev was super fond of fiery speeches, but he never really consolidated his power and was eventually pushed out by a triumvirate led by Leonid Brezhnev. The next 20 years were marked by stable politics and economic stagnation. Two conservative premiers followed Brezhnev before Mikhail Gorbachev was named first secretary of the Central Committee in 1985. We'll talk more about his reforms next week, but essentially he pursued simultaneous political reforms, known as glasnost, and economic reforms, perestroika, that ultimately led to the demise of communism and the Soviet Union. I have focused primarily on some of the negative aspects of Soviet rule, but the legacies of the Soviet state were not all terrible. The legacies of state ownership of the means of production and authoritarian rule are, how you say, problematic, as was the creation of ethnic-based republics that didn't perfectly match the populations within them. But the Soviet Union did experience significant economic growth and development. Great statistics aren't available, but it does appear that Soviet economic growth outstripped European growth in the 1950s, and while they never closed the gap with the West, the quality of life for its citizens did improve over time. The Soviet economy also became a fundamentally industrial one, moving beyond its agricultural base. They achieved military parity with the United States for a time, and made significant scientific achievements in the space race. Women's rights advanced more quickly than they did in the West, although this was not a trend that stuck. And the Soviet Union left a legacy of relative economic equality. While inequality existed in the Soviet Union, and is certainly on the rise in Eurasia today, levels of inequality remain, on average, a little lower than other regions of the world. So that is Soviet history in an extremely broad brush. We'll talk more about the political legacies in class.